Hello. Today is Wednesday, May 15th, and welcome to episode 336 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI Senior Fellow Lester Munson. I'm joined today by NSI's founder and Executive Director Jamil Jaffer, NSI's Deputy Executive Director Jessica Jones, and my fellow Senior Fellow Bishop Garrison. We are going to talk about copper today, a critical mineral. As of late last year, people have realized copper is important. Why is copper important? Copper is an essential component in electric vehicles. It matters to the U.S. military. It is something that is mined around the world, but is going to be in what appears to be increasing demand going forward, and substantially increasing demand, as much as 6 times in the next few years what it is today. The Western Hemisphere is one of the largest producers of copper. Chile and Peru producing each about 20% of the world's supply. Central Africa is another huge supplier of copper. There's a game afoot between the West and China to see who can extract that copper. The U.S. is funding a thing called a big infrastructure project called the Lobito Corridor to ship copper on rail out of Central Africa to the west coast of Africa and the Atlantic Ocean. China is working very hard to establish a new rail line to Africa's east coast and to the Indian Ocean, so it can maintain control of that copper. This is a big play for the future because of this energy transition that is happening from carbon burning vehicles to electric vehicles. If you drive an electric car, you're probably driving around with about 125 pounds of copper inside your car, an amazing thing. So this is a big question on the national security front. Notably, this impacts trade, of course. The Biden administration has very recently announced 100% tariffs on electric vehicles from China. These are the same electric vehicles that the Biden administration is subsidizing in the United States. This is as radical an industrial policy as you can have, incentivizing domestic production and really trying to dissuade anyone from buying things made cheaper abroad. This, I will just say, from my view, and I want people to react to this, violates the essential laws of economics and is going to be fraught with a lot of problems going forward. And we're going to find ourselves in a really difficult situation. Bishop, I want to go to you first. What are your thoughts about the Biden administration's approach to copper and electric vehicles and these very difficult economic
Well, I
questions?
mean, at the end of the day, it comes back to strategic competition. We've continuously seen China on the African continent putting in a great deal of investment into infrastructure for their own gains as a government, for their own industrial gains. And this is exactly what this part of it is. If they can take advantage of this situation and corner for themselves the copper industry, whether or not you recognize it as a critical mineral, we can all agree that it's in a variety of electronics, from EVs to radios, to tactical radios for the military. It's in telecommunications devices. It's everywhere. So if China can get a hold of this and figure out a way to corner the market and to ensure that the rest of the world relies on them, their technologies, and their resources in order to utilize that copper in less expensive, productive ways, they're going to do it. So I think the Biden administration is taking a first step. I don't think that this in and of itself is going to solve the problem of Chinese aggression in this particular aspect, but it's at least a step to get them others moving and thinking about it, getting our allies to actually make some moves in terms of pushing back on China and their efforts in this particular industry.
Jamil, we all want to push back on China. We don't want them to dominate anything, particularly things that we think we're going to need in the defense sector or, for the future of transportation, that kind of thing. But will this work? Is this a policy that actually makes sense and you can execute effectively and will thwart the Chinese threat?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to take a lot more resources if we're really going to thwart the Chinese threat. I mean, they're pouring billions upon billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into this effort. And it's not just copper, it's cobalt, it's lithium, it's a variety of critical minerals. We've seen, by the way, China exploit its control over critical minerals to influence other nations. We saw them cut off Japan from its supply of certain critical minerals a few years back. We've seen recent efforts to slow the the export from China of other critical minerals. So this is a tactic, and this is a tactic they've sort of telegraphed to us for years, because we've seen them acquire mining assets, we've seen them acquire processing assets, both overseas, but also building capacity inside of China. So today, for example, with cobalt, 70% of the world's cobalt comes out of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. China controls a huge percentage of those mines, but then also they control 90+% of the processing. So even if you get cobalt yourself, you can't process it anywhere but China. And so this is a real problem. And if the U.S. is going to solve the problem, whether it's with cobalt or with lithium or with copper, as we're talking about today, we've got to really quadruple down on this effort. It's a few $1 billion here and there is important. It's good. Development Finance Corporation, that's important efforts, right, to make that happen. But we're looking at onesie twosies, each mineral one by one. This has to be a larger scale effort. And frankly, it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars if we're going to do it effectively. And we've got to partner really tightly with allies. We have to partner with people we don't love, including countries that have corruption issues and the like. And so if American private companies are going to go into this, we're going to have to give them some top cover when it comes to, going into and dealing with regimes in Africa that are used to, leadership in Africa that are used to getting payoffs, right? Because the Chinese pay them off, right? Other nations pay them off. And we have very aggressive, rightly so, very aggressive rules about corruption and payoffs. And, some American companies are going to do this. We're going to need top cover, and how you figure out how to do that while also acting consistent with our values. That's a real hard problem to solve. And we don't have a solution to that problem today.
Jones, I want to ask you a slightly different question. The Biden administration is effectively turning off the supply of cheap electrical vehicles from China. That is a boon to presumably a boon to American domestic production of EVs, which has been fraught by high costs and low demand. A lot of those vehicles, just coincidentally, happen to be built in Michigan, which also coincidentally happens to be a swing state in the upcoming presidential election. Is this a pure politics play by the administration here in an election year?
Well, so before that, I kind of want to go off what Jamil was saying, because what I find interesting, obviously, we're trying to catch up to China right now on these continents, and they've been, with their Belt and Road projects, infrastructure's been built, they've been having projects for years, and we've talked here on the show about dollar for dollar, we aren't able to compete, we don't want to compete with Belt and Road, and trying to find partners that can help us. And I think what's interesting in a lot of the stories you're reading about what's going on in Central Africa, a new partner that the Biden administration is building ties with is between Gulf states in a lot of these Central African countries and Latin American countries, right? That you have the U.S. brokering deals with Saudi when it comes to Congo and cobalt. You've got in Zambia, the U.S. and the UAE. Like the Biden administration has tried to build ties there because, the Gulf countries are trying to diversify their own economy. They don't have the history that the U.S. and probably other Western countries have with a lot of these other nations we're trying to build ties with. And so we see some new partners that might help us in this mix. Which just ties me. There was a story in the Post about how we've got, the Middle East is the new capital of the Silicon Valley, right? You've got the Biden administration trying to build these ties with Gulf states. And so I think that's a really interesting piece here as we look to the future of how we begin to compete with China when it comes to critical minerals or materials, as we so discuss here on the show. And so when you come to the EVs, and I know there was a piece by Paul Krugman that was exactly to your point, but disagreeing with you about the short-sightedness of seeing the Biden administration tamping down on EVs coming from China, and that it's not going against market forces, that there are very, real industries and communities and states that are hurt in particular by the kind of subsidized low-cost EV technology coming out of China. I don't think it's just a political play, though, just to win votes in Michigan. I think that, the Biden administration, and there's wings of the left and right that see future in, new technologies and the transition into green technology. And they're trying to build up the industry here in the U.S. and right now, and it's the same conversation happening in Europe, right? When it comes to EV and the transition with cheap products and overcapacity.
Can I add one thing? The big question here is, what is our policy from an economic and security perspective regarding the African continent? Our diplomacy cannot be focused purely on the economic benefits of critical minerals. And it feels like the U.S. typically only cares about African countries when it comes to exactly that right now. So this is an opportunity for the Biden administration to actually set forth a sound policy moving forward vis-a-vis Africa. And I'm not as cynical as Les when it comes to Michigan and voting either. I want to add that.
Yeah.
All right. I want to hold on, Jamil. Jones and Bishop. No offense, you are both wrong.
I knew
This
that
is
was
a
What a
pure
surprise!
political play
You're wrong.
for votes in Michigan. Michigan is going to be the swing state in this election. It certainly looks like that right now. That is why we're seeing these crazy politics on Gaza. It is why we are seeing a huge discussion of tariffs on electric vehicles from China, which, by the way, will not stop China from producing electric vehicles. They will just sell them somewhere else. And that means those people won't be as likely to buy our stuff. And in the long run, it will make our industry less efficient. This kind of industrial policy does not work. Yes, I understand the rationale for it. The problem is it doesn't work. It never works. We should come up with a different approach. And the real problem is the opposition party, the Republicans, are not coming up with an alternative strategy themselves. And that's the real shame. And we need a party that is about free markets and reduced regulations on business that will actually incentivize the U.S. business community to be the robust actor in the world, which it is not.
This is a first step.
Jamil,
It's not an end state. Sorry. Go ahead, Jamil. Sorry.
Yeah, I actually think Les is right in part and wrong in part. I do think industrial policy can work. I do think it is not anti-free markets and anti-conservative. I think industrial policy, we've always had industrial policy in this country, whether it's the building of our telecommunications system, whether it's the building of our defense industrial base. We've always spent, and whether it's seeding R&D funding for advanced technologies, right? The U.S. government has always engaged in industrial policy. But I agree with Les that the goal of that industrial policy should be to incentivize American production, not simply autarkically cut off foreign production. But I do think the Chinese EVs do represent a strategic threat to the United States, and I think it's the right move to cut that off. And I don't think it's just about Michigan, although of course it's about Michigan. If it's not about, they'd be idiots if it weren't about Michigan. To Bishop's point, though, about Africa, I actually think it's not fair to say U.S. policy has just been about extraction, right? We've obviously had
about terrorism too. It's been about counterterrorism
there.
I was going to say terrorism too.
It's also been about lecturing African countries on their social values and telling them they can't use certain kinds of energy sources. To be clear,
all true and all problematic, but PEPFAR is a good example of an American policy that for many, many years, right, 2 decades now nearly, has been a policy that's about the African continent, about helping that continent, helping the countries and the people there. So I don't think it's fair to say U.S. policy has always been purely self-interested. Although, look, that's just the world we live in. It's okay to have self-interested policy. That's how every country works. That's the nature of the world system. Like, I'm a realist. Like, let's not kid ourselves.
The more money we spend on subsidies, the more money
problems
we will waste. All right. Thank you for joining us for this critical conversation about copper. That's a wrap. Thanks so much to Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Friday, May 17th for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. Fault Lines is now on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.